Hi everybody, welcome to our DAT IQ weekly market update. This is our update for January 24, 2023, episode 231. I'm Dean Croak, market analyst here at DAT Freight and Analytics, sitting in for Ken Adamo today. And I'm joined by special guest all the way from British Columbia, Damon Grewal from Centurion Trucking. Good morning, Damon. Thanks for being on the show.
Good morning, Dean.
Yeah, good to have you with us. We've wanted to have you on the show or I have certainly for months now, but I was watching the Highway Through Hell show on Weather Channel, and the first 3 episodes of the new season are about the floods in British Columbia. And I had no idea how bad it was when the Coquihalla got shut down, Trans-Canada Highway. So you guys are impacted. I'm curious, how long did it take for that whole highway to reopen?
Ooh, it took a couple weeks because we were cut off from the rest of Canada. So we're on the West Coast, and on the West Coast, we were cut off from all the surrounding provinces. We had to actually get permission from Washington State for the carriers that had to service the remainder of Canada through BC for permission to actually go through the highways and re-enter into Alberta and the surrounding provinces.
Yeah.
But it took a while. I mean, the floods took quite the havoc on the roads, washed some of them away. So there was major architectural damage that had to be checked out before we could actually go back on those highways and get going.
Yeah. So tell us a bit about yourself and your company for the benefit of the listeners.
Well, for sure. I mean, Centurion Trucking, we're more of a long distance, long haul carrier, for hire carrier. So we're mainly team service. We run coast to coast, pretty much from the west to the east. We go there in as little as 2 days, 3 days, but we go all over the US, all over Canada. Both dry van and refrigerated is our main type of hauling.
Right. Yes, I see your trucks over here in Boston occasionally. So that's a fairly niche market. Would you say that's a niche that a lot of carriers are working in because of the distances between capital cities in Canada?
It's a tough niche. One is when you're going coast to coast like that, it's team drivers, and trying to put 2 drivers together in a cab is always a difficult situation. And to maintain the longevity of that, because you're out on the highway for so many days at a time, a lot of drivers like the short hauls and where they're back within 1-2 days. But for us, it's getting that specialty of saying, okay, how do we match these drivers together? How do we get them coast to coast? So it does become a very niche type of market for sure.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll bring Damon back a little bit later in the show, folks. Remember, we're here at Tuesday, 10 a.m. Eastern every week, 7 a.m. Pacific, talking about the freight market. Most importantly, though, we're here to answer your questions. So let's get your questions into the chat section on the respective platform. And with that, let's watch some of the key trends we're looking at this week. Spot rates were down for all trailer types this week. The average was down about 6 cents a mile. We'll cover some of the details later. Not surprisingly, given the amount of capacity in the market and the shorter shipping week. Active contract rates in routing guides down 1% in the last 2 weeks versus the first 2 weeks of the year. Down 2% in reefer, 1% in van. The replacement rates coming into routing guides from RFPs in late 2022, down 4% in dry van and 13% in reefer. Other news, ACT Research reported the second highest number of trailers ordered on record going back to 1996. Jennifer McNeely from ACT Research said most trailer makers continue to see demand exceeding capacity through the end of 2023, although some manufacturers report a supply chain shortage of some of the parts is still lingering. Other data out last week, we're watching, of course, the single-family housing starts continue to drop, down about 10% year over year, down significantly in December. It translates to about 280,000 fewer flatbed loads in December versus the December prior. A little bit of good news, though, on the market as it relates to single-family housing. The National Association of Home Builders Wells Fargo Housing Index improved slightly in December. That was the first time builder sentiment had improved after 12 straight months of declines. So let's jump into our market update. Let's start with the load-to-truck ratio in dry van. Martin Luther King Day last week brought the third short shipping week in the last month, so spot market volumes were lower, making some of our week-over-week comps difficult. Volumes were about 62% lower last week and about 7% lower than the week 3 average over the prior 6 years. Equipment posts at their highest level they've been in many years, about 45% higher than the previous 6-year average for the week 3. Load to truck ratio down to 2.42 loads per truck last week. In refrigerated, volumes in the spot market continue to trend lower, of course, driven by lower produce volumes in our key winter markets in Florida, Arizona, and California. Major producers of domestic winter produce volumes are around 40% lower year over year for the middle of January. Yuma, Arizona, the Winter Salad Bowl is pushing out some more volumes. Things have been pretty good down there, even though it's been cold recently. Volumes are up 4% year over year, while Florida is still feeling the effects of a slow start to the produce season following Hurricane Ian. Volumes are down about 30% year over year in the Sunshine State, and California, one of the biggest producers of fruit and vegetables after weeks of much needed yet devastating rain. Volumes are currently about a third of where they'd usually be this time of the year. Important to remember, though, out of California, growers are in between seasons, and this is typically the low point in terms of truckload volumes, but still way down. Carrier equipment posts at their highest level in many years. Load to truck ratio in refrigerated dropped to 3.03. And in flatbed, load posts are currently at their lowest level in 7 years. And that's in stark contrast to the previous year's flurry of activities, where spot market volumes for flatbed were almost 5 times higher in January last year. Load posts are about 53% lower than the 6-year average. Equipment posts also at their highest in 7 years. Load to truck ratio ended last week at 11.19, the lowest level since 2016. Having a quick look around our markets, only 3 states reported gains last week. Capacity was tight in Colorado. Rates were up to $1.46 for outbound loads. Most of the gains were driven by the Grand Junction market. In New England, where a series of storms have battered the region, more on the way this week. Capacity was very tight in New Hampshire, rates up 10 cents a mile to $2.21, while in neighbouring Maine, rates increased 17 cents a mile to $2.65 for outbound loads. That's the second highest outbound rate in 7 years out of Maine. LoadLink Technologies, part of the Roper Technologies company, it's also a partner company with DAT Freight and Analytics, reported Canadian spot market volumes were down 31% year over year to end 2022. Outbound loads from Canada to the United States fell slightly in December, still down 34% year over year. However, in the last week, there's been a flurry of activity for loads from Canada to the US. Load posts were up 16% week over week in Toronto, up 14% week over week in Alberta. And where Damon's from in British Columbia, volumes surged last week for dry van volumes, up 42% week over week. And the other lane we wanted to look at this week was the high volume intermodal lane, Los Angeles to Chicago. Truckload capacity continues to loosen following the plunge in West Coast imports, recording the 5th straight month of double-digit percentage declines in import volumes. At $1.63 per mile last week, dry van rates on this lane are exactly half where they were a year ago when the ports of Long Beach and Los Angeles were experiencing record congestion levels. Having a quick look at the refrigerated market, this week's USDA truck rate report, only 2 produce regions reported a slight shortage of trucks last week. Nogales, Arizona, for loads of winter vegetables coming across from Mexico. And as always, capacity is tight in eastern North Carolina for loads of sweet potatoes. State-level reefer rates in North Carolina up 10 cents a mile last week to $2.14. That's the second highest in 7 years, driven by solid gains on long-haul lanes in Raleigh, North Carolina to Lakeland, Florida, and Stockton, California. Loads west of Stockton were paying $1.22 a mile. Remember, folks, these are line haul rates excluding fuel. So at $1.22 a mile, that's 12 cents a mile higher than in December, but 20 cents a mile lower than this time last year. And on the 650-mile lane from Raleigh to Lakeland, loads were paying much higher at $3.20 a mile, although that's still about 50 cents a mile lower than this time last year. DAT's highest volume reefer lane, Atlanta to Orlando, rates continue to cool at $3.01 a mile. That's about $1.20 a mile lower than this time last year. A lot of carriers run this lane back and forward. So if you look at the round trip equation, rates on the northbound lane from Orlando back to Atlanta are even lower at $1.18. But when you look at the total mileage and the total revenue, average round trip rates on that lane are about $2.10 for dedicated carriers. Northeast capacity was tight in Connecticut and Massachusetts, rates up 6 cents a mile to $2.16. Strong gains in the Springfield mass market, outbound rates up to $4.32. They jumped about 72 cents a mile last week. A lot of the gains were on regional short-haul lanes to places like Harrisburg at $3.55 a mile. Having a look at our flatbed market, capacity was tight in Florida last week following a surge in load posts, up about 59% week over week. Outbound flatbed rates were up 24 cents a mile to $1.61. Solid gains in the Tallahassee market. Rates were up to $2.69. Demand was very strong out of Tallahassee for loads to Lakeland. Loads there were paying $3.11. That's up 11 cents a mile. And Miami up to $2.55 a mile. Having a look on the West Coast, Oregon state rates were flat at $2.43. Solid gains reported in the Portland market, rates up 9 cents a mile to $2.53. In one of the bigger flatbed markets in the Pacific Northwest, Medford, load posts were up 11% week over week, but still there was plenty of available capacity. Line haul rates for outbound loads dropped 13 cents a mile to $2.33. In Los Angeles and San Diego flatbed markets, load posts were up last week, spot rates up 9 cents a mile to $1.95. Los Angeles outbound loads to Las Vegas and Phoenix were at 12-month lows at $2.65 and $2.69 a mile, respectively. And in British Columbia, in the Prince George market, load post surged last week for flatbeds. High volumes of loads moving to Stockton out of Prince George. It's a 1,400-mile lane. Rates were at a 12-month high of $2.90 last week, 73 cents a mile higher than in December, and exactly the same as where they were this time last year. So wrapping up with our year-over-year look at spot rates, the national average dry van rate following a similar path to early 2020, where following the oversupplied 2019 market, spot rates fell in early 2020 as the industry continued to shed capacity right up until the pandemic began. At $1.85 a mile last week, rates are 87 cents a mile lower than this time last year, following last week's 7 cents per mile decrease to $1.85. Last week's national average still 26 cents a mile higher than in 2020, and about 25 cents a mile lower, though, than the top 50 lanes for loads moved in DAT's network, which averaged $2.12. In the refrigerated market, after ending 22 on a high, national average reefer line haul rates have dropped by about 13% or 33 cents a mile since the start of this year. Following last week's 9 cent per mile decrease, line haul rates last week averaged $2.18, just over $1 per mile lower than this time last year. And in flatbed, national average line haul rate ended last week at $2.10. That's 58 cents a mile lower year over year, following last week's 3 cent per mile decrease. Flatbed rates continue to track closely with the 2018 market, especially early in the year, even though they did dip down before taking off. Last week, rates were down slightly, still about 20 cents per mile higher than the pre-pandemic average for week 3 of the shipping year. So that's it for this week's market update. Remember, if you want to find out more about what's happening in freight, you can go to dat.com this evening and download our weekly report. And with that, it's over to the short-term forecast. So let's start off with dry van. Now, remember, these are our short-term forecasts going out 35 days. For those new to the show, the blue line is a rolling 7-day weighted moving average of historical rates for loads moved over 550 miles. So they're line haul only, long haul excluding fuel. In green, that's our flagship model rate cast. That's in all of our products. Red is the short-term model that more heavily weights data seen more recently. And then you have the yellow and grey blend, which are blends of the two in varying degree. So unlike last week, when the models saw a lot of agreement, this week we're seeing the forecast start to disagree some more, especially the short-term model over the next 3 weeks, a little bit more pessimistic. Ratecast expects rates to bottom out at about $1.75 a mile. The short-term model is a little bit more pessimistic. On the positive side, what you're seeing there is that all 4 models show we're a few weeks away from all 4 forecasts agreeing that we're going to see rates bounce back. That's not unusual to see that this time of the year. This is the quiet season. That timing could be a little bit optimistic, given we're still seeing spot market capacity overshoot demand for loads this week. In fact, we've been seeing that all of this year, but there certainly is some agreement in the latter part of February that the market will be turning. Having a look at refrigerated, we're still seeing more pessimism coming into the model outlook. No surprise, given produce volumes in those key regions are way behind where we'd normally see, especially in the big markets. The 2023 produce season doesn't really get going until the Vidalia pack date for onions is announced in Georgia sometime in April. That's officially the starting line, even though we start to see some volumes come out of Florida late January, early February that start to influence that. But the produce season really doesn't start till April. So we're a few weeks away from seeing the inflationary influence of produce season on those reefer models. And then to wrap up with flatbed, all 4 models are seeing the quiet season in full effect. With agreement that rates will pick up in early spring. Even the short term in red still has long haul rates at $2 a mile, which is good news for carriers given how much demand is stalled. Housing starts are still way down, and the latest manufacturing numbers from factories in December down about 1% year over year. So that's putting a drag on the flatbed market right now. So with that, that's the end of the market update. Remember to drop your questions into the chat section. We want to bring Damon back into the show and start off with the question of the week. So Damon, what are some of the challenges ahead for West Coast carriers and brokers, especially those where you're from in British Columbia?
Wow, I think the biggest challenge that I think we're facing ourselves is understanding the market, because there's some weeks that are really busy and then some weeks that are really slow. And so trying to get that information, what my recommendation to everybody would be, get the data, right? And Dean, thank you for putting this data out there, because larger corporations have always had the data. And some of the smaller to medium-sized companies are the companies that have always struggled getting data because they don't have the resources to be able to obtain it. And to have shows like this and have you kind of go out and tell us what's happening in the marketplace is phenomenal. And I think if people just study that and what the trends are to businesses, that's going to be the biggest challenge for them to kind of take that data, interpret it, and move ahead and have that discussion with their customers, right? So I think that's going to help them get a grasp on what's happening in the market, and that way they're not, picking up extra trucks if they don't need to, or they can pick up additional capacity or seeing trends in their marketplace. And with the freight market slowing down, there's always companies that pick up the slack, right? So every time we look around outside, trucks are always moving. And Vancouver's not a big market, but it's steady enough that you start realizing that if someone's going this way, someone else is going this way, and that's it. And we saw this a couple of years back in the U.S. where the last downturn, we'll start seeing companies fold away. And we're already seeing that here on the West Coast, is that certain companies are starting to say, oh, you know what, we don't want to deal with the headaches of trying to find freight, trying to find customers, and they're just choosing to close the doors and move away. And then there's other companies that are picking up the capacity when it comes to those type of situations.
Right. So Damon, one of the things we learned from Chuck Snow from Traffics when he was on the show late last year, he said that a lot of Canadian carriers never really leave Canada without a return load already booked. Do you follow a similar practice, given that you have to load back across the border anyway, I guess, with those backhaul loads back into British Columbia because you're crossing the border into Canada? So do you follow the same mentality where you always book your return load before you leave?
Not necessarily, no. Just because we know how the markets are. So let's say, for example, right now we know Arizona and California are hot. That's a no-brainer. Send your trucks down there all day long. You don't have to worry about getting a backload. There's something going to be out there. You can go into other markets like Texas, but even the places where we know, okay, there's a certain amount of freight that's going to materialize in that area, or we have options. So anytime we come into the East Coast, New Jersey, New York, Boston, we know that if we can't get something out of there, we'll be able to head up into Toronto, Montreal, and be able to grab something from there to come back. And so it's not necessarily that we have to come directly back to Vancouver, but we could take different routes. And then there's also different provinces that we could kind of resort to get back. But you're not necessarily looking to book both ways before. You just take the load. You have to go. You got to service that customer, because he's not going to care whether you have a reload or not. They just need that product delivered. And especially with team service, it's got to go. Yeah.
Right. Mostly refrigerated, or a mix of refrigerated and dry van trailers?
We're both. Yeah. Right. So we're kind of 60% on the refrigerated side, 40% on the dry van side. And yeah, so a lot of the stuff that we're doing is like produce. We're doing electronics. We're doing seafood, horticulture. You kind of name it. It's a broad mix of products, auto parts. We go into like Michigan all the time with Ford and GM. But yeah, you name it. We're doing quite a bit of freight.
So most of your miles for your trucks will be in the US then, it's fair to say?
A lot of our miles are in the US. Yeah. We
Right.
don't really run intra-Canada as much as we run into the US. So a lot of our legs are out of BC going all over the US. And then we're figuring out whether to come back to Western Canada or we come back through Central Canada.
Right. What are some of the intricacies of cross-border freight as it relates to paperwork and lodging paperwork and avoiding delays at the border?
It's just basically having knowing the custom brokers, right? Knowing how to get through the the paperwork process just across the borders. Making sure that your drivers are fully aware. There's a lot of fines that could occur if you're not crossing that border properly. You're not doing your pre-arrival notifications. So just making sure that the paperwork is in fact there, right?
Right.
Clear communication with the customer. If the customs invoices are supplied to us ahead of time and there's no disruptions. I mean, we picked up a load a little while ago from Texas, and it was through one of the major brokers in the U.S. and this was one into northern, and so we picked up the load and we had the customs document and they had no custom broker set up. So we brought that shipment back to the border. We were stuck there for a couple of days.
Wow.
And I mean, everybody was on fire at that point to be like, all right, let's figure out how to get this done, how to get the clearance set up. And, and you don't expect that, right? Especially from the major brokers in the U.S.
Right.
Just don't go any moment. And being aware that there is different procedures for crossing the border. And it's not a typical U.S. to U.S. move. You have to be on top of it.
Right. And I guess when you're loading out of British Columbia, you're like within an hour of the border, right? So you have to have everything ready even before the truck's leaving the yard, correct?
Yeah. So It's, and a lot of people won't give you the paperwork prior to loading just because the quantity can change at any moment. And so we got to report, specific quantity, weights, everything, because if it doesn't match, then you're getting pulled over for inspection at the border. And there's possible fines and violations as well. So a lot of people won't. So right away when something gets loaded, like we're pretty much 20 minutes from the border from where our yard is. And and we got to give a 2-hour prior notice to the border. And a lot of shippers want us to load and go. Right? Yeah. Sometimes how sensitive some of these things are, especially if you're delivering to like the Costco's or Walmart's. Sometimes our customers are getting POs like last minute. And so they're expected to fulfill those POs and have it delivered next day.
Right. Yeah. Damon, for those not aware and don't listen to the show, Damon is also a sponsor of Dan Deegan's Sales Chatter show. That's a live podcast at 9 a.m. Eastern every day. I'll be on it tomorrow morning. Damon, tell us how you got involved in that, because you're involved in broader industry issues, not just running a trucking company.
Yeah, the whole reason I got into the ownership side of trucking was just so we could teach people how to do things the right way. And that's something that Dan really brings to the table. And he was one of the first people that were actually teaching people how to find customers, teaching people how to do it the right way. Right. And, just like yourself, Dean, I mean, there's so many good people that want to see people succeed and do it the right way. We don't have to take shortcuts. And so from the beginning, I'm also, board of directors on the BC Trucking Alliance as well as the Canadian Trucking Alliance. And the whole purpose of that is just so that we could teach better to the industry and pass everything that we've learned forward to the companies that may not have the resources or may not have the facilities. But education is huge, right? There's no manual that teaches us how to do trucking. We have a lot of regulations, but where's that manual that tells you how to do things in the right, proper way? And it tells you, like watch out for your cargo insurance. How do you keep your trailer safe? There's no manual for this, right? And so that's something that I've always been very particular at, is saying, okay, you know what? If we've learned it and we learned it the hard way, our job is to make sure the next generation learns it a little bit easier and has that available to them, so they're not making the same mistakes that we've made in our past or we've seen other people make in their past.
Got it. Yeah. What are some of the big or the major policy issues that you're working on with the British Columbia Trucking Alliance at the moment?
Out of BC, so Driver Inc. has been a big one, just making sure that everyone's paying their taxes properly and everyone's able to compete on a fair, fair scale across the table here. So that's been kind of one of the bigger issues. Besides that, I mean, it's just making sure that we have enough facilities on the highways for the drivers, making sure that the rest areas have washrooms available to the drivers. Um, it's pretty basic stuff. Yeah, nothing seriously that's on the table right now. But
Okay.
ELD mandate just came into place across Canada, so that's one of the issues that we're working on. There's always emission controls that are happening in the West Coast. We kind of follow suit with California. So if something happens in California, we're pretty much following suit in British Columbia to make sure we kind of match those guidelines. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different regulations that are going on. Nothing too major. that's uncommon.
But a lot of you and the larger carriers up there in Canada would have already been on electronic log devices, correct, for quite a few years?
Yeah, so anyone that's running cross-border, we've had them implemented for years now. It's the people that are running intra-Canada and, for example, like British Columbia to Alberta, some of these runs are 13 hours, 14 hours, and people were still using the paper logbooks to be able to do some of these runs, so they wouldn't have to show, the on-duty times and everything else. Even though in Canada, we do have longer driving limits. We do have a 13-hour drive time limit. But still, at that, if there's winter conditions or if there's highway closures, construction, those delays do happen, and the drivers are still kind of, some guys are still on paper, and so just trying to make sure that everyone's again on an equal playing field.
Right.
To say, hey, you know what, ELD is in effect, let's make it mandatory. And again, when it comes to auditing or regulations, if people half are on electronic and half are on paper, it makes it hard for the auditors and the scale operators to really enforce it.
Yeah. Damon, of course, it's winter. One of the, there's a TV show about how bad trucking is up there in British Columbia. Tell us about some of the things that you have to do in winter that you have to apply to your drivers, like in terms of training or equipment or chains. What do you have to do differently in winter in BC?
Oh, wow. Yeah. So, I mean, I think a lot of this applies to the Midwest US, Northeast US. It's similar
Right.
type of regulations. But yeah, chaining for sure is one of them. All the additives. I think you mentioned a lot of this on some of the shows that you've been on, Dean. But yeah, I mean, you have to be careful. It's we go through a special winter training with the drivers every season just to kind of remind them of what can happen. Because when you're going across country, like we were looking at some of the dash cams that we have on the trucks, and you look at Montana, and Montana is like nice and sunny, and then you go into North Dakota and it's like a winter storm, and so the weather patterns change from like a couple hours to the state, from state to state to state. And so when you have clear conditions and you go into like black ice and winter conditions, you really have to be careful, and your mind has a way to play tricks on you too. So being aware that, hey, you know what, I need to take precautions, and even though like it was beautiful just a couple hours ago, and now we're into this type of weather. Even with the mountain passes, right? It's retraining the drivers on how to drive on hills and how to be the slowest person coming down a hill, because if it's black ice, you can't stop. And you see this over and over again especially in the U.S. and some of the highways when it's a whiteout condition. I mean, you can't see 10 feet ahead of you, 20 feet ahead of you. And we always talk about the 2 football fields that it takes to actually stop a loaded truck and trailer on highway speeds. And so if you don't have that visibility, you have to be cognizant in your mind. And sometimes you may think it's just a little cloud that you can't see through, but you don't know how long that cloud or how long that fog is going to last. So it's a lot of awareness training to the drivers. And if you've seen some of the highways in the States are much better, so the drivers like those highways. But if you look at Canada, and especially like Northern Ontario, I've been to some of these highways where you literally have like this much shoulder on the side of the road. It's a single lane, a single lane highway. And literally this is the size of the shoulder. Yeah. And so you go like this and you go, the next thing that's gonna happen is all over to the side. And so it's a game of centimeters or a game of inches. Yeah. And so if you take your eye off the road and you're not aware of what the conditions are, or you're going too fast for conditions, anything can happen at any time, and it's scary.
Yeah. So big question, steel chains or other sorts of chains like those socks I see? Steel?
No, we're old school, so we stick with the steel chains. I mean, it's a hassle every year, but that's the requirement. And if that's what we've been we've been taught on, we'll stick with it
Yeah.
until those SOC chains come in or get approved by government. Then we could maybe take a look and switching to easier modes.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
those chains are
fascinating.
heavy, right? So,
Yeah. I've seen them on some of those shows up in your part of the world, and they have these weird sort of. They're not steel. I'm not sure what they're made of, but they seem to get into more trouble than not. But I think you're right. A lot of it comes down to driver experience and awareness and training. So I'm glad you covered that. So, Damon, that kind of brings us to the end of the show. Time flies. We'll have to get you back on the show soon. A couple of shout outs this week. As we just mentioned, I'll be on the Sales Chatter show that Damon sponsors. Centurion Trucking is a sponsor of Sales Chatter. I'll be on tomorrow with Ryan Muhammad and Jeff Dickinson, 9 a.m. Eastern. You can connect with them on LinkedIn. Robert Rouse is going to be on Landline Now on Sirius XM Road Dog Radio 146 at 7 p.m. tomorrow evening. I'll be on with the famous Jimmy Mack on Radio Nemo, 8 a.m. Eastern on Thursday, channel 146. I'll also be in Tucson Friday speaking at the Great West Casualty Company Truckload Carriers meeting. Don't forget, the latest edition of Freightvine is absolutely brilliant. Professor Kaplis in Ayub and special guest Ari Ash from the Journal of Commerce joins us. That'll be out this week. And remember, you can find us all here again next week at 10 a.m. Eastern. My market update will be published this evening. Go to dat.com/market update. And of course, it'll be on our new IQ dashboard. And with that, it's time to wrap up the show. Damon, how can people contact you if they want to ask some questions about BC trucking?
Just find me on LinkedIn. That's the easiest one. That's the one I respond to the quickest. Also, I think my email address is on there as well. If not, Dean, feel free to share it. But thank you again to DAT and yourself for what you guys did in the industry, for everything you guys were able to share. Appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you, Damon. You've been a wonderful advocate for the industry through your comments on the Sales Chatter show. It's always educational to get your feedback as we're talking about some of the industry conditions. So thanks for being on the show. Everybody, we'll be back here at 10 a.m. Eastern next week. And with that, we'll wrap up the show. Be safe, everybody.